On March 23, 2015, at 3:18 in the morning, Lee Kuan Yew passed away at Singapore General Hospital at the age of 91, triggering 7 days of national mourning and drawing hundreds of thousands of citizens who queued for days in the rain to pay their final respects. To understand the true scale of what unfolded under his leadership, we need to look at a single figure. In 1965, Singapore's GDP per capita stood at around $500. With no natural resources, no independent clean water supply, and rampant unemployment. By 2015, that figure had surpassed $55,000, placing Singapore among the 5 wealthiest nations in the world. What makes this trajectory all the more remarkable historically is where it began. Lee was the only leader in modern history to govern a nation that gained independence through expulsion, not through a liberation struggle, but through a forced removal from the Federation of Malaysia on August 9, 1965. Lee Kuan Yew was born on September 16, 1923, into a Hakka Chinese family that had been settled in Singapore for several generations. His grandfather, who held a deep admiration for British culture, gave him the nickname Harry, a name he used in everyday life well into his young adulthood. His father, Lee Chin Koon, worked as a depot manager for Shell, a position that placed the family in the comfortable tier of colonial Singapore's social hierarchy and gave Lee direct access to the elite English language schools that were, at the time, the primary pathway to social mobility. His academic path was linear and precise. Lee attended Raffles Institution and then Raffles College, and in the senior Cambridge examinations he achieved the top ranking across all of Singapore and Malaya, an accomplishment that directly opened the door to a scholarship in England. At Raffles College, Lee was actually outscored by Kwa Geok Chu, the woman who would become his wife. The two married quietly on December 23, 1947, in Stratford-upon-Avon, before holding a formal wedding ceremony in Singapore in 1950. Lee began his studies at the London School of Economics before transferring to Fitzwilliam College, Cambridge, where he graduated with a double first, the highest academic distinction in the British university system, achieved by only a small fraction of students, in law. But before all of that, there was one event that fundamentally shaped how Lee understood power. On February 15, 1942, Singapore fell to the Japanese, a defeat that Churchill himself described as the worst disaster and largest capitulation in British history, shattering the myth of Western colonial invincibility. Under the climate of occupation, Operation Suk Ching, a systematic massacre of ethnic Chinese civilians carried out by Japanese forces between February and March 1942, claimed between 25,000 and 50,000 lives across Singapore and Malaya. Lee witnessed this reign of terror firsthand as an 18-year-old. To survive the Japanese occupation between 1942 and 1945, Lee took a position as an English-language editor in the Japanese military's propaganda department, a role that gave him a direct first-hand view of how an occupying power constructs public narratives to sustain its own legitimacy. From those 3 years under occupation, Lee distilled one conviction he would never abandon. Weak and disorganized nations will always be objects, never subjects, of larger forces. And this belief would later become the philosophical justification for the entire architecture of his hardline policies as a leader. Upon returning to Singapore in 1950, Lee chose to practice law with a specific focus on representing trade unions, a strategic decision that gave him access to a grassroots network of Chinese-speaking communities, a constituency entirely beyond the reach of his fellow English-educated elites. The People's Action Party, or PAP, was founded in November 1954 as a coalition between two ideologically opposed factions: pragmatic English-educated moderates and pro-communist Chinese-speaking leftists, a tactical alliance that Lee understood from the outset to be temporary and ultimately destined for confrontation. In the 1955 general election, Lee won the seat of Tanjong Pagar, and he held it without a single defeat for more than 50 consecutive years, making his electoral record one of the longest in the history of parliamentary democracy anywhere in the world. In the 1959 elections, the PAP swept 43 of 51 seats in Singapore's Legislative Assembly, and Lee Kuan Yew was sworn in as the first Prime Minister of the newly self-governing nation, at the age of 35. On 2 February 1963, Operation Cold Store detained 113 people in a single night, among them Barisan Socialis leaders, trade union activists, and students, all without trial under the Internal Security Act. The operation structurally crippled the only opposition force that posed a genuine threat to PAP dominance. With the left wing neutralized by Operation Cold Store, Lee formally severed the alliance and purged the leftist faction from within the PAP, a move that consolidated the party as a pragmatic, technocratic organization no longer bound to any left-wing ideology, but to efficiency and outcomes. Lee pushed for merger with Malaysia not out of nationalist sentiment, but out of concrete calculation. Singapore was too small, economically and demographically, to survive as an independent entity. The Federation of Malaysia was formally established on 16 September 1963, encompassing Singapore, Malaya, Sabah, and Sarawak. The fundamental conflict between Lee and Kuala Lumpur centered on the slogan, "Malaysian Malaysia," a demand for equal rights across all races, free from ethnic hierarchy, which clashed directly with the Bumiputera privilege policies upheld by the central government under Tunku Abdul Rahman, a tension that would find no compromise resolution. Tensions between the Malay and Chinese communities in Singapore finally erupted from July through September 1964, in a series of racial riots that killed 23 people and wounded hundreds more, demonstrating that demographic conflicts long managed through political means could rapidly descend into physical violence on the streets. The negotiations to separate Singapore from the Federation of Malaysia were not conducted in the open. Goh Keng Swee carried out secret talks with Kuala Lumpur, while most members of the Singapore cabinet were kept uninformed until the final decision had been reached, a pattern of highly centralized decision-making that would become a defining hallmark of Lee Kuan Yew's leadership style. At the press conference on 9 August 1965, Lee Kuan Yew wept on national camera, a moment he himself would later describe as a moment of anguish, making it one of the very few public appearances across his entire political career in which the emotional composure he so rigorously maintained appeared to completely break down. While most developing nations in the 1960s relied on protectionist development models, building domestic industries behind walls of tariffs, Lee Kuan Yew and Goh Keng Swee chose the opposite course: export-oriented industrialization, aggressively courting multinational corporations with structured packages of tax incentives and guaranteed legal certainty. The Economic Development Board, established in 1961, was designed as a one-stop agency that cut through bureaucracy for foreign investors, streamlining permits, guaranteeing regulatory consistency, and serving as a single point of contact for incoming capital. This institutional model proved effective enough that it was later adopted as a reference by numerous developing countries seeking to attract foreign direct investment. The results were concretely measurable. Between 1966 and 1973, Singapore's economy grew at an average real rate of approximately 13% per year, one of the highest growth rates recorded anywhere in the world during that period, driven by the expansion of labor-intensive manufacturing and rising trade volumes through the port. The Housing and Development Board, established in 1960, fundamentally transformed Singapore's residential landscape. The proportion of citizens living in HDB units rose from near zero at its inception to approximately 87% within 3 decades, while home ownership rates surged from around 9% in 1970 to nearly 90% by 1990. Lee Kuan Yew explicitly stated that the home ownership policy was not merely an instrument of social welfare, but also a calculated political instrument. Citizens who owned property had a direct stake in the stability of the state, making them structurally far less likely to support movements of a disruptive or revolutionary nature against the existing order. One of Lee's most controversial decisions was designating English as the official working language and primary medium of instruction, a choice that directly sacrificed the dominant position of the Chinese language, yet was deemed essential to securing global economic connectivity, while also serving as a neutral tongue that privileged no single ethnic group over another. To mitigate the social impact of English's dominance, a bilingual policy was established as the National Education Protocol. Every student was required to master English as a first language alongside their respective mother tongue, Mandarin, Malay, or Tamil, a curricular architecture designed to balance global economic competitiveness with the preservation of communal identity across all 3 major ethnic groups. The Corrupt Practices Investigation Bureau, or CPIB, was significantly strengthened under Lee with one unusual mandate. The agency was granted the authority to investigate anyone without exception, including cabinet ministers and senior government officials. Lee implemented a policy of high public official salaries as a calculated anti-corruption measure. By paying competitive wages on par with the private sector, the government structurally reduced the financial incentive to accept bribes, making Singapore's ministerial salaries among the highest in the world. Meritocracy was applied systematically through civil service recruitment based on examinations and academic achievement, not ethnic connections or family networks, a bureaucratic architecture that produced a technocratic elite whose loyalty was directed toward the state, not toward individual patrons. Lee consistently deployed defamation lawsuits as an instrument against political opponents and foreign media. The International Herald Tribune, the Far Eastern Economic Review, and opposition figures such as J.B. Jeyaretnam and Chee Soon-Hwan were among those sued, with some ending up legally bankrupted as a result. The Newspapers and Printing Presses Act granted the Singapore government the authority to revoke publishing licenses on an annual basis, a mechanism that effectively encouraged self-censorship among local media without requiring any explicit prohibition of any kind. Lee argued explicitly that press freedom must be subordinate to national interests and the objectives of an elected government, a position he maintained consistently throughout his political career and never revised as a policy error. The Internal Security Act, a legacy of British colonial legislation, was retained and used by the PAP government for detention without trial. Its most massive recorded use came during Operation Cold Store in 1963, though the ISA continued to be invoked on a smaller scale throughout Lee's years in power. Singapore's GNP per capita rose from approximately USD 920 in 1965 to around USD 23,300 by the year 2000, an increase of more than 25-fold over 35 years, a rate of growth unmatched by nearly any other developing nation during the same period. Singapore's literacy rate climbed from approximately 72% in 1970 to above 93% by 1990, 2 decades of massive investment in education that served as a direct foundation for the economic transformation then underway. The Port of Singapore grew into one of the busiest ports in the world, by the 1990s handling more than 1 million TEUs of container cargo per year, serving as the true backbone of the transit economic ecosystem that Lee had designed as a survival strategy from the very beginning of independence. Yew, Lee Kuan Yew's wife, was not merely a ceremonial companion. She was a licensed attorney who co-founded the law firm Lee & Lee with Lee in 1955 and maintained an independent legal practice for decades as a professional in her own right. When a stroke robbed Yew of her ability to communicate in the final years of her life, Lee Kuan Yew, a leader known publicly as calculating and unsentimental, would routinely sit by her side each evening and read poetry aloud, a behavior that stood in structural contradiction to the institutional image he had cultivated over 5 decades. Yew passed away on October 2, 2010. In his memoirs, Lee explicitly wrote that he had lost half of himself. And on various public occasions afterward, he admitted he never fully recovered, a remarkably candid admission from a leader who had spent his entire political career avoiding any expression of personal vulnerability. Rajaratnam, a founding member of the PAP and the principal architect of Singapore's foreign policy, wrote the text of the Pledge of Singapore in 1966. A document that opens with the words, "We, the citizens of Singapore," and formally codified Lee's vision of multiracialism into language that, to this day, every school child in the country is required to memorize. Lee Kuan Yew stepped down as Prime Minister on 28 November 1990 after 31 years in office, handing the position to Goh Chok Tong. Yet this transition did not signal a withdrawal from the structures of power. He remained in cabinet as senior minister until 2004, then as minister mentor until 2011, preserving institutional influence for 2 additional decades. In 2004, Lee Hsien Loong, Lee Kuan Yew's eldest son, was sworn in as Prime Minister of Singapore, drawing criticism over what many saw as a structured political dynasty. The elder Lee responded by arguing that his son had passed through the same meritocratic selection process as any other official, though critics noted that the selection system itself had been designed and controlled by the very apparatus he had built. Lee documented his version of Singapore's history in 2 memoirs, The Singapore Story, 1998, and From Third World to First, 1965-2000, both of which became primary references widely cited, yet also criticized by a number of historians as deeply selective narratives in which the perspectives of the opposition, political detainees, and groups affected by repressive policies are given virtually no space. Lee Kuan Yew's state funeral was held on 29 March 2015 at the University Cultural Center. His coffin was borne on a military vehicle along a route that traversed the city, witnessed by hundreds of thousands of citizens who stood along the streets in the rain, a scale of public mourning that a number of social analysts have noted as a rare phenomenon of collective emotional mobilization in modern Southeast Asia. The Singapore model, a combination of competitive authoritarianism, technocratic meritocracy, and full economic openness, became an explicit reference point for China's leadership. Deng Xiaoping visited Singapore in 1978 and was demonstrably inspired by this approach in designing China's economic reforms, which separated market liberalization from political liberalization. Lee was the principal architect of the concept of Asian values, the argument that collectivism, hierarchy, and consensus are values organically more suited to Asian development than Western individual liberalism. The concept drew sharp criticism from scholars such as Amartya Sen, who viewed it as an intellectual construct selectively deployed to legitimize restrictions on civil rights in the name of developmental efficiency.